Welcome to Work in Progress, an exploratory podcast hosted by the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria, where you will hear from artists, curators, gallery staff, collaborators, and even different hosts as you listen to each episode. This podcast was produced on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, also known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. In this episode, we hear from Gaëtane Verna, director of the Power Plant in Toronto, and Sarah Milroy, chief curator at the McMichael Canadian Art Collection, as they discuss the exhibition they curated, Denyse Thomasos, Odyssey. Organized by the McMichael and on display at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria from December 11th, 2021 until March 13th, 2022. Joining the two curators is Victoria-based award-winning novelist Esi Edugyan, who provided a written contribution to the exhibition publication. We were thrilled to host this exhibition in Victoria and provide an opportunity for our community to learn about the work of Trinidadian-Canadian artist Denyse Thomasos, whose contribution to Canadian art was exceptional. Her work often took the form of large-scale paintings or murals that were vibrant and layered not only in their material application, but in their themes and content as well. This conversation offers a window into Thomasos' work from a range of perspectives. Verna, who had been following Thomasos' career from the early 2000s and had worked with her over the years before her untimely passing in 2012, brought an intimate take on the trajectory of Thomasos' artistic practice. Milroy, as a curator and art critic, provides the context of how Thomasos' work stands out within the larger scope of Canadian art, while Edugyan, who it is apparent felt a strong connection to the artist and her work, had just been introduced to Thomasos through this project. We hope you enjoy the following conversation.
That's wonderful. This is just, I have to say, what an incredible thrill it is finally to meet you, Esi. It was this like leap into the void that Gaytown and I were like, what would be really great, would be if we could get Esi Edugyan. And it was like, no way. But then it happened. So we're so grateful to you for being willing to, fit us into your life and your world. And your very, very busy writing schedule. It has made such a difference. It's expanded so much our understanding of the work, and the public that buys this publication have a real treat in store. So thank you again.
No, thank you for inviting me to take part. I was so surprised and so happy to be asked, because I really haven't done anything like this before, done that kind of writing, and it just gave me an opportunity to really commune with Denyse's work. And I really feel like there's, I just felt such a kinship with her work and even with her life story, which intersects with my own in so many ways. And so it was a real pleasure to be a part of this.
It was just so great. I thought it best, Gaytown, to start with a wonderful picture of Denyse, because you're the only person here, I think, on this call that knew her. And this picture seems to tell us a lot about her. And I'm just curious how you see this picture, what it tells us about this incredible lady.
Wow. Well, thank you, Sarah. And it's so nice to meet you, Esi. And I can tell you that Denyse was a fierce woman. She was an avid reader, and she would have been so proud to have you, pen such a beautiful text about her work with so much insight about, what some of the things she was thinking. And you would have been fast friends, and she would have given you advice on your entire life, because that's the type of person she was. So when I see her picture, I am filled with so much emotion, even to this day. And so the first time I met Denyse's work was really because it was around a year 2000, and there was all of these projects that the Canada Council had, created specific grants for. And so I received a postcard, which had like this incredible abstract painting with a lot of lines and different colors. And I don't know if it looked like a kente cloth or if it was a series of shutters, or I don't know what I was looking at. And then I received this postcard and I pinned it to the wall in my office, and I left for maternity leave and came back a year later, and the postcard was still on my wall, and started thinking about, okay, I don't like a lot of painting that really speaks to me, but I don't know this artist, but this really speaks to me. And the person who had replaced me during my maternity leave says, well, why don't you reach out to her? And then I start Googling a bit, and I'm actually, I don't know if we used Google at the time, sorry, but researching on Denyse, and only to suddenly realize that, this incredible Canadian artist had such, had received like Guggenheim Fellowship, Pew Fellowship. I mean, worked, studied in Toronto, but then did an MFA at Yale. And I was just like mesmerized by her. And basically I sent her an email, introduced myself, and told her that I wanted to do an exhibition of her work. She emailed me back and said, well, I don't really want to show my paintings. I would like to do a site-specific exhibition, because she also understood from the get-go that, there are works you do in a commercial gallery, and then there's works that you do in a, let's say, museum setting. And so she very much wanted to have the opportunity of working at Bishop's University. So she had done a show in Austria with David Hammonds and Ed Clark and Stanley Whitley, where she had done 2 walls. She had done some walls in her commercial gallery in New York, but she had never taken over an entire space. And really what we started, and we have to bring ourselves back. We did this show in 2004. So you have to remember, in 2001, there's all the events around 9/11. Denyse starts traveling at that same time. Mm-hmm. And then as she's traveling, it seems that there's constantly war and war and a lot of contention in the world. And yet, when we start thinking of what project we could do, she's thinking of home. And when she speaks of home, she's thinking of Trinidad Tobago. She's thinking of a house that was a shared home by her family, which all of her aunts and uncles and her mom would always talk about this house. And so really we started speaking about what could be a project that was suitable for Bishop's University. And this project became a 2-part project. One part was at Bishop's and the second part was at Mount St. Vincent University. And so our part was 30 years in Canada and 30 years in Trinidad. So on the one hand, we had a painting, the whole walls of the gallery. You had a section that really presented the floor plan of that house, imagined by each member of the family. Then you had a rendition of the structure, architectural structure of the house, where which chair, the TV, the radio, all of these very familial objects, from interviews she had done with her aunties and her uncles and her mom and her. And then on this space that we see, which brings so much emotion to me, she had the backdrop of the architecture, and then it was her free-flowing painting in that space and showing us how, and for those of you who have seen the exhibition, it is that same emotion that you see all around the walls of the galleries. Everybody was so taken by the work and was mesmerized by the works. And everybody was like, why are you painting over these walls? You must keep them. And it's like, well, no, this is part of the idea. We have to let them live. The walls are the palimpsest. And I always think, whenever I go to Bishop's, because my daughter is there, I like touch the wall and think, oh, somewhere in the layers there is that work, that inhabits the space and stuff. So it was a really important show for her, and we did a small publication where I did an interview with her. We had Franklin Sermon, who's now the director of the Pam Perez Art Museum. We also had oh my God, now I forget her name. Famous Trinidadian author, but sorry, it will come to me. We had different authors, writing about Norbesi Phillips wrote about Denyse and Franklin and myself. And I think that the day Denyse died, because unfortunately she passed away in 2012, and with her gallery we did a small memorial. And my emotion when I saw that the book we did was the only solo publication that had been done on Denyse. And believe you me, when I was at Bishop's, we had no money. And so this was really pulling resources with my colleague, Ingrid Jengner and making it happen and providing an artist with some kind of documentation of the two projects.
So the beat goes on, because we then, all these years later, Gaytane, I came back and asked you to help me again. We had just acquired this very, very large scale and beautiful work for the McMichael's collection. And nothing like it in our collection, needless to say. There is nothing like it anywhere on earth. And it just seems to me to capture the kind of incredible spirit in the work that it's both this kind of, everything's barely holding together, but there's also a sense of momentum, like it's going somewhere. And there's a kind of, just I think from the sheer force of the creativity in it, that sense of imagination and creativity, there is this sort of feeling of hope, I think, that, that you get from that. And we, in part of our courtship dance with Esi, I will disclose that we sent this painting to her in Victoria to live with as part of the enticement for joining us in the book. Not something she asked for, needless to say, but it just seemed to me, how can you appreciate this painter if you don't get a chance to experience the tactility of the thing and the way the painting's put together? So maybe, Esi, you can tell me about living with this and kind of where the journey took you.
Yeah, so I was delighted to be asked to take part in this. Denyse Thomasos was not an artist whose work I was, very familiar with when I was asked. So I was, really happy, first of all, to be introduced to a new painter, but that the work was so powerful for me. It really spoke to me, and I remember being sent at first JPEGs of her pieces and getting the JPEG of Odyssey, and just being so blown away by it. But, in receiving this piece in the mail and unwrapping it, and I have to admit, initially I had set it down and it was the wrong side up. And then, I recognized immediately this, that I had to turn it, and that there was this sense of great, like, a tension between a kind of stasis in her work, but also a powerful sense of movement. And you feel this immediately when you're in the presence of one of her pieces. You're struck by this strange tension. And I mean, when you first look at it, it's a series of lines. There's the abstraction really stands out, the sense of color, sense of balance, and then your eye is immediately seeking to make sense, or to shape things into something. And what is it that you see? And initially, what I saw was a coffin. Like a really old, sort of handmade, kind of 19th century.
Back of the cart.
Yeah, exactly. Back of a cart that you would roll the coffin in, onto the carriage. And so I had this sort of more, I guess, a darker, a more sort of morbid, a more kind of sense of reaching deep into history. All of these, I guess, all of these sensibilities and all of these meanings were coming at me. But then I also, the longer I stared at it, the more I could begin to feel a kind of transformation taking shape. And what I saw then was a kind of like a boat, like a fisherman's boat. And I could see suddenly up in the left-hand corner, I could envision that we have a sort of abstract stripe that could be a bird in the blue sky there. And that what we are seeing is something that has movement, and that's something that comes out of, if we think of, I'm from the West Coast, so when I think of boats, I think of leisure. And that's something that's, quite a bit lighter than the coffin that I was initially envisioning. And so I loved that. I loved that there was this aliveness and this life and this movement that was kind of, I guess, counterbalanced by a sense of, of weight.
Gravity. Gravitas.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Gravitas. And that this was something that kept shifting for me. It sort of depended on my mood. I'd sometimes see a boat, sometimes see a coffin. And her work is so just replete with so many different meanings. And so much of what you see, I guess, it's all there. I think all of these meanings are intentional and left to coexist. And And that's something that is very unique about her work, is that you have these very, very disparate things that are constantly in tension.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things too you mentioned in your essay that I know Gaytown and I both were really struck by, it's like that's so clear, it's right there, and we sort of hadn't realized it, is the fact that she's dealing with certain themes in Black history, like the Middle Passage and so on, but there's no bodies present.
Yep.
And you made a really interesting point about that. Can you talk about that for a minute before we move on? Because it was just great insight.
Yeah, you see it in this piece, but you also see it. If we could look at Odyssey again, that would be great.
Yeah.
Because yeah. So this is a piece where when I looked at it, I saw kind of like a shipping vessel of some sort, carrying whatever it is, like containers. But then I also could see within it something more static, which was like a neighborhood. And then, these are buildings within a very congested neighborhood. And I was struck by the way that we have a sense of, if it's a neighborhood, we have a sense of the homes and the businesses and everything that I guess gives structure to our lives, but that it's completely bereft of people. There's never, she's not a figurative painter, so her subject is not the body, but we feel the resonances of that absence, like for instance, when she's painting something that resembles the prison industrial complex, or something that resembles a slave ship. What we're getting is the structure, the thing that contains us. And that thing is sometimes something that offers refuge or solace. You think of burial grounds, and sometimes it's something that is very oppressive. Yeah. And that seeks to, imprison us. But we don't have the slave. We have the slave ship. We don't have the prisoners. We have usually what looks like blueprints for a prison. And I thought that was really remarkable, that we have, I guess, these very, what's the way to put it? We're seeing what's been made by the human hand, but we're not seeing the human. And so there's been so much of, I was looking with a Massey lecture at the history of Black representation, specifically within 18th and 19th century portraiture, and how that changed going into the 20th century. We initially sort of had these figures who were mostly slaves, or when they weren't actual slaves, just, I guess, ideas of represented ideas of slave life, or we have figures who are connected to Christianity in some way. We have magi. We have these very very sort of specific sets of figures which are repeated throughout these centuries, and it seems like Blackness is reduced to certain tropes. And as we come into the 20th century, that starts to shift, especially with the end of the 20th century, when you see artists like Kehinde Wiley, for instance, I guess he's a 21st century artist, just kind of taking those tropes and subverting them. But I think Thomasos is also subverting those tropes, but how she's doing it is by showing us, the structures that contained these bodies, rather than showing us in a kind of more
literal way. Yeah.
Literal way, but also I think the word I'm looking for is like exploitative way.
Exploitative way.
These bodies. And
so here is a piece that we're happy to say is going to be shown at the Whitney Biennial in April. It's an epic work that is, I don't know, how big is it? Gaytown, 20 feet long? Yeah.
It bigger? It took like the entire wall in your gallery. Yeah. And I would say that Esi, when Denyse started working, she was always, first of all, as a person, she was very politically inclined. When she was at university, she did figurative work when she was at Sheridan College. And she was always, so the Black body in her early works was very, very present. And then when she goes to Yale, she removes the body because she really wants to use structure and color to express the presence and containment without having to represent the body, which is really interesting when we look at now the fact that it seems that, every day you discover another, amazing African or African-American painter, and every gallery has these incredible painters that are, representing the Black body in a different way than how it was represented before. But Denyse, much like artists like Stanley Whitley, or Ed Clark, they were that group of artists who chose abstraction as this way of gaining a certain freedom in what you can express without like this exploitation of the Black trauma or the Middle Passage, without having to show these bodies, without having to show how a jail or a ghetto or how all of these structures of containment oppress your soul, your body. Yet with her masterful way of painting and expressing, and then also the poetry of the title, because Displaced Burial or Burial at Gorée, I mean, whether you understand what that means and what it represents, you feel like you're, in layers and layers of history. And even though the bodies are not present, it's like the painting is haunted. Like through Denyse's way of painting, she's expressing those presents.
Can I ask a question? Because you knew her. Was there kind of like a moment where like a strong schism, like she just sort of felt very intensely that she was not going to paint figuratively anymore? Was it, or was it kind of more sort of more nuanced transition where she sort of had an in-between period? Or I'm kind of curious.
I think that it really happened when she went to Yale, because Denyse was very, like, she was driven, she was focused, she wanted to be an artist, she wanted to be a professional artist, she wanted to teach. And I think when she leaves Toronto, goes to Yale, being in that context, a top art school, and wanting to understand conceptual art, conceptual painting, wanting to move away from representation, or feeling that she needed to move away to expand her understanding of the world or of her own practice. It's really, that's at that moment that the shift happens.
So was there a particular teacher that she studied under that, that sort of would have helped her to sort of understand that this is the place that she wanted to move to?
I think that from what I remember, and in talking with different people who knew her, because Yale was so competitive, she kind of observed the others, and was also reading a lot. And then I think decided that, I don't want to put words in her mouth because actually I never asked her that question specifically. So I'm just telling you what I've been able to recollect. It was kind of this thing like, and probably you have to think that, a Black woman painter at Yale, and also, figurative painting in those years is probably not where it's at, because remember, there was the shift of the death of painting and all of that. So I think she really very much thought, I need to be a conceptual artist. I need to be an artist that goes beyond the representational, but how does, and to use forms and shapes to express a presence, but also to create a production of works that cannot be just boxed in to a simple reading, to expand the reading of her work outside of the scope of I'm representing, so that there's multiple readings, which in a sense also enables her to expand the reach of her work. And so there's a sense of staying underground, right? You love the abstraction of this work, but do you really know what you're looking at? And not having to reveal inside of a painting, everything. And having
you feel it. I mean, but the difference between this piece lying on the floor and this piece up on the wall. I mean, when Gaytane and I were installing this, I think both of us felt like we'd never really been in a situation where when the work moves from being flat or tipped against the wall to being up on the wall, that it was like a complete, you had to kind of step back. It was like the force of this thing made you feel actually like you couldn't quite get your footing. There's such a vortex of movement, and it was really, really visceral. And right after this, she starts looking at these works that sort of suggest weaving and cloth. I think that Gaytane's mentioned kente cloth before, and her interest in Caribbean textiles from her Trinidadian background. But it quickly starts to move, and there starts to be this sense of a kind of cyclone type of feeling that we're swept up in something. And, at home in Tianjin, around this point, she's starting to travel. As Denyse, Gaytane has told us, after 9/11, she had this kind of moment of, oh my God, I don't understand the world at all. I need to get out there. And she did, traveling in China. And I can't remember all the places she traveled, Gaytane.
She did like Eastern Africa, China.
Africa.
And I would say also because she's from Trinidad, and because her family has Indian, Black, Chinese, I mean, she sets out to connect with all the parts that are, she is the sum of those parts. And I think you feel that movement. You feel that she's on a quest. Yeah. And one thing I want to tell you, Esi, is that to go back to your question, is that I forgot to mention is she's living in Philadelphia teaching, and she decides that she wants to live in New York and she wants a job in New York. And that burial at Gore is part of a whole series of large scale black and white paintings that she makes going, this is my ticket to leave Philadelphia and to go to New York. So she imagines already in her mind, sets a course for herself, and starts within a few months to just produce these large scale paintings.
And they're massive all of a sudden.
All of them, and there's a sense of urgency, but there's also like a sense of wanting to be ambition and this empowered artist that is like, I'm setting my goal for New York, and this is what's going to get me to New York. So that period of the black and white is definitely also a shift.
And now she is going to be in New York in the most major way. I mean, it's just so very sad that she's not here to see her paintings go up on the wall at the Whitney Museum, but we'll have to just go down there and shout to heaven for her. But, this is typical of the kind of confusion you were talking about, Esi, about, is it, are these coffins, are these huts, are these containers? Like, what are we looking at here?
Yeah, and it's interesting just flipping through the slides, because we have this sort of style that's informing places, like this is the Dogon Caves, but a similar sort of stylistic blueprint look to the Tianjin piece and the Jodhpur rooftops, which kind of maybe suggests that this sense of claustrophobia, and the sense of human structures as being something maybe like just that this is a global feeling. This feeling,
do the structures in society and architecture be a kind of metaphor for that? Are they shelter? Do they provide shelter to us, or confinement, or both?
Exactly. But in all societies, which is interesting.
And she was always interested in vernacular architectures, So there's a sense of this humble dwelling to the skyscrapers, to the ports, these paintings that she's done of different ports. But there's always that shape, and I always feel that because, if you analyze her work from beginning to end, this, the coffin, the containment, the structure is really the key to everything, and it's as if you think of what is the origin of the Black experience, or if we go more precisely, what is the origin of Denyse's experience in the world? It goes back to somebody being taken away from homeland in Africa, put in first in a prison or in contained space, then on the slave ship, and then, plantation and all of this. So it's as if this is what permeates everything that she's thinking of, and then this idea that she moves from the slave ship to the ghetto. And then if we think of the narrative of the Black body, of how there are more, let's say, after the end of slavery, there are more Black folks in jails than during the time of slavery, how America has constantly, haunted, Black bodies to contain them, whether it is physically or in their minds. And so she's constantly searching at this. And I remember when she started this whole research on not military, but mass, carceral.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, why is she going there? Like, just me thinking, and to see how, years later, we see all these movies that are really documenting how this was another way to contain Black bodies, And
point out to the audience that the picture we're looking at here from 2003 is based on this idea of the panopticon, or the prison structure that is designed for surveillance of, in many cases, Black bodies that are imprisoned. And she turns it into this kind of cyclone spin that she then infuses with all these extraordinary colors. But there's a number of works like this in the exhibition, like Surveillance is another one. But I understand, Gaytane, from you, that she would do extensive research on incarceration of Black men and women, and she would go down these research rabbit holes. But then the solution, the expression of it would come to be very somatic.
Yeah, and I think also what's really interesting with Denyse, she would work in her studio. She would work simultaneously on large scale paintings and small scale paintings, all of them aligned together.
Huh. And did she talk about that as being something that she really needed to do, that that balance needed to be there for her to create? Or was it just why do you feel she did that? Or did she speak?
Oh, this is her studio, one of her studio assistant that I interviewed. And she just told me this is how Denyse worked. So, and also you have to think as an artist who was thinking of, I need a practice that's let's say my own, but also I need to think of, what I can sell in a gallery.
Yeah.
So to constantly think of how to be strategic while still expressing that same emotion on different scales.
Right. Sorry, is it more difficult to sell or to have a gallery take a larger piece? Is this?
Well, I mean, large space pieces, who's going to buy those pieces? And then if people want to live with the work, so you think, and in her shows, you always had some large pieces, medium pieces, small pieces. So this balancing act. But when I found out that when she did a series, she would work on different scales. I was like, God, she's so smart. It's like she's really thinking.
I think the incredible thing is, and we looked at the very beginning, Esi, when we were looking at the painting that you lived for a while, and there was one other little slide after that where the Black boat shape is going up in the corner. I can tell you, walking through the show and looking at those paintings, the little ones, they pack a punch. It's that formal capacity that she has coupled with the skill with color. Mm-hmm. It's almost like she's trying to see how much explosive dynamite she can pack into the smallest possible container, because they're not less impactful than the big works. I mean, something like Burial at Gore is environmental in scale. So obviously that has a kind of vertiginous effect on you. You can't even kind of get your bearings,
Yeah, I would fully agree. And maybe it's kind of, if you think of it in terms of writing, it's the balance between writing a short story, which has certain principles and tends to move more swiftly than a novel, and, can still pack a whole world in, but in a much more contained way. Whereas a novel more kind of has maybe a little bit more space and more languorous and takes more time. And so I'm curious, having made that analogy, just how long it would have taken her to complete, for instance, the smaller piece that I wrote about, versus something like Burial at Gorée? Like, did she spend years on that massive canvas, or like what was her process like in terms of?
I think that series, as I said, the Burial at Gorée, it was part of a slew of works that she did because she wanted to get a job in New York, but I would say that she could work really fast. And also the type of painting that she uses is very liquid, so she's not working in oils. So it's really, it dries fast. And then also she always has layers of work. And then she would, her studio assistant was saying that how sometimes, like the piece, which unfortunately I forget the title, the piece that's at U of T, that piece, she had it in her studio for many, many years. And then sometimes, she would add stuff to it. And it's a very colorful piece, right? So that one I would say is kind of like a world in itself, which was present in the space while she was doing other series of work.
I'm just really curious too, Esi, having stepped back to write the Massey lectures and considered, Denyse in the context of so many other artists that you were thinking about. Do you have a sense now of what's distinctive about what she's given us?
I mean, probably what I mentioned earlier, just this sense of dealing with the Black body or with Black experience in a way that is not wholly abstract, but
it's non-figurative, but not abstract.
Yes, exactly. That is exactly how I would have put it if I wasn't at a loss for words. That's exactly right.
I think the other thing is too that, and Gaytane and I talked a little bit about this in the interview that we did, that there is this feeling in all of these works really about rootlessness, about these cities seem to sort of be suspended and to not really kind of drive their pylons down into anything fixed. And I wondered aloud with Gaytane if that maybe spoke to some aspect of diasporic, experience, that everything is floating and contingent and could change and could move, Yeah,
a sense of unrootedness, or what do you say? In Germany, they would say unheimlich, like a lack of homeliness, or a sense of home, which I think is very much kind of at the heart of diasporic experience. So yeah, definitely.
Because we never quite know where we're from. Our names are not our names because, our names were given names. People whose family are, from the diasporic, tradition, like my last name is Verna, but I come from Haiti. So where's that Verna? My ancestor was brought to Haiti. So Verna is probably not my real name, or my mom's last name is Lanier, and Lanier it was the name of the plantation owner. So what was the name? So you kind of even a name that's your name, except Gaytane, which I know my parents gave me, but the last name is not, there's nothing that grounds you in certainty of who you are and where are your roots. When people say, where are your people from? I can say Haiti, but then again, what came after? And I've always found that, and even in Denyse's work, this yearning to search, to go to India, to go to China, to go to East Africa, to try to set forth, to figure out what she can tease of what she thinks makes who she is without formally being able to pin down. And so I think that when we think of her search for identity in a certain sense, and we couple that with the works, there is that sense of floating. You never know. You're always between seas because somehow you were taken away from one shore and brought to another. And then you also have to think that not only did she leave that history, but then she leaves Trinidad and then goes to Toronto, at 8
goes to Yale and then goes to New York. Then
that's it. So there's this constant, she's not African-American, and she's of the Caribbean, and with everything that entails, this archipelagos of identity. And then you add the layer of Toronto, which is another transition. So I think that it feels like all of that is, part of the type of painting she does, where nothing is fixed. It's always kind of floating, even though she's talking about structures.
Yeah, but they're not rooted.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. There is this, I think initially you're hit with this sense of claustrophobia. You've got those strong, powerful lines, and you've got the chaos of them as they're intersecting. And sometimes this is done a little bit off kilter. And so it's, it's
disorienting. Mm-hmm.
Really disorienting. But then, as you settle into it and you really start to notice things, there just seems to be, in a lot of the paintings that I observed, a kind of exit point in each of these structures. And whether that's, a series of buildings that seem to not have roofs. And so there's a sense of being able to escape. Whether that's, a coffin that seems to have an open lid, like these kinds of things, where you have both the sense of containment and oppression, but also the possibility of an exit. And I think that's something that's so beautiful in her work. You have all of these resonances, but the possibility of hope, is what remains.
Yeah.
And I would say, to second that even if you look at the work like Burial at Gore, and, there's a light somewhere that feels like there's something that's taking you out of the frame. So it's not like a gloomy, the title says it, but at the same time, there's a sense of a light that lives on beyond. It's as if, regardless of the condition, there is the soul that goes beyond the frame of the painting. And so in her works, as you never quite know if you're in a realistic space or or in an open landscape, but there's always this play with light that pulls the eye of the viewer to a corner. And there's this sense of escape. There's always a diagonal that's like pulling you outside of the frame of the painting. And that could be what creates to the viewer the sense of hope,
And momentum. She's using the term humanity. And I think, it's one of the things that's so powerful about her work is that obviously it's coming very much out of this experience of the Black diaspora. But when we look at the kind of forced migrations, whether it's because of climate change or political unrest in parts of the world, Syria, Afghanistan, etc., the world is just on the move, and there are no pylons driving down into the rock, it seems. And so it just, with each passing year, her work becomes more and more profoundly urgent for us to understand how we move into this 21st century of ours and, preserve our humanity and preserve our way of life and safety and shelter and so on. So, it comes out of a very specific personal history, but it speaks, I think, really broadly.
Mm-hmm. And I think also that the sense of hope, if you think, of the experience, the lived experience of the enslaved people, you have to have hope to make it every day, then have children not knowing if they would still be your own, they would be taken away. And then still, when we think of people like Harriet Tubman or Frederick Douglass, this notion of hope, of wanting to escape and of creating your own imagination, whether it is through songs, dance, finding kingship in a very brutal atmosphere, and still, I always think the idea of bearing children still, there's a sense of hope. You give birth not knowing what tomorrow is made, and then you risk your life escaping to the north to freedom because you believe there's something else for you no matter what. And so I always have so much respect for all of these people. And even, I was looking at when you look at the images from people fleeing Afghanistan, it's like these people know the urgency of needing to leave, yet bringing their children, not being, they're afraid, but they know that this is part of humanity, the sense of survival, no matter the fact that you don't know what's in front of you, but you push through. And I think that's also those types of emotions that are very evident in Denyse's work, And then Sarah, I think it was your son who said when he was looking at Burial at Gore.
Yes. He said it reminded him of Guernica.
Yeah.
Just about the same size, right? But the main panel of it. And that sense of like everything's upside down and everything's moving, and it's black and white, but it still manages to have all this incredible expressive force, and the graphic component in Picasso in that work to, create this kind of nightmare, world that is also so visually compelling you can't sort of tear your eyes away. As a protest for a great human injustice. I thought I was really impressed. I was like, whoa, okay, I can start taking notes.
I thought that's such a, like, even though we're referencing Picasso, but I think the way your son put it, it's like Denyse does this painting. By the title, it speaks of enslaved people and the tens of millions that were, had the same experience, yet they're not present. And yet it's a testament to those 400 years, to those, those years. And to me, when you told me that, I'm like, wow, like this is another reading that just brings it all back together. This painting in itself feels like the testament to this trauma, right? And in a subtle way, without taking advantage of the bodies, but yet expressing everything in it,
Yes.
And it sounds like a brilliant kid you have.
He's looked at a lot of art in his life.
Well, then let's hope that her work, and maybe that piece in particular, gets brought into the scholarship and the conversations enough that it gets the mileage that Guernica's had and the impact, exactly. Get it into that conversation, into that dialogue. Thank you all for taking the time to listen in on this insightful conversation, and much thanks to Gaytane, Sarah, and Esi for expanding the conversation around this exhibition and the life and work of Denyse Thomasos. Work in Progress is generously supported by the Canada Council for the Arts Digital Now grant. For those who want to learn more about Denyse Thomasos' Odyssey, visit aggv.ca.